He thought she was invisible in his house, but in court, she was about to become the only voice that mattered. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where decisions were measured in quiet breaths and the weight of a single sentence could change a man's life forever. And yet no one noticed her at first, seated in the last row, hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture calm but deliberate, like someone who had learned long ago how to exist without being seen. Naomi Carter wore a simple navy dress, nothing that stood out, nothing that invited attention. The same kind of clothing she wore while cleaning marble floors and wiping fingerprints from glass surfaces that cost more than her yearly income. And still, there was something about the way she held herself that didn't quite match the role everyone had already assigned to her. At the front of the room, Richard Castellano sat beside his attorney, his presence commanding even in stillness. A man whose tailored suit fit like armor, whose silence carried more authority than most men's voices. His sharp gaze fixed forward as if the entire proceeding were just another negotiation to be endured, calculated, and eventually won. The prosecutor paced slowly across the floor, each step echoing softly, building a narrative that felt airtight, confident, inevitable, and the jury leaned in, absorbing every word, every carefully crafted detail, the room tightening with quiet certainty that the outcome had already been decided before the final statement was even delivered. No one looked back at Naomi, not the jurors, not the reporters scribbling notes, not even the bailiff standing near the door, because to them, she was exactly what she appeared to be, just another domestic worker pulled into a world far above her understanding, a minor witness at best, a formality at worst, someone whose presence filled space but added no weight. Naomi's eyes moved once, slowly, from the polished floor to the man on trial, and for a fraction of a second, something passed between them, not recognition exactly, not familiarity, but awareness, the kind that doesn't need words, the kind that settles quietly and refuses to leave. Richard didn't react, not outwardly, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift that no one else would have noticed because no one else was looking for it. The judge adjusted his glasses, preparing to move forward, his voice steady, practiced, detached, the sound of it carrying across the room like a signal that everything was proceeding exactly as expected. And still, beneath that controlled surface, there was a tension building, something unspoken, something waiting for the right moment to surface. Naomi exhaled slowly, her fingers pressing together just enough to steady herself, not out of fear, but out of decision. The kind of decision that doesn't come suddenly, but forms over time, layer by layer, until silence becomes heavier than truth. Around her, the room remained unchanged, confident in its assumptions, secure in its hierarchy, unaware that the quietest person present was holding something none of them had accounted for, something that didn't belong to status or power or wealth, something that could not be dismissed once spoken. And as the clerk called the next name, the sound echoing clean and official through the room, Naomi Carter lifted her eyes, steady now, unshaken, as if she had already stepped beyond the place they believed she belonged, and was simply waiting for the moment the world would realize it too. The clerk's voice rang out again, clearer this time, carrying a name that did not seem to belong in a room like this, Naomi Carter. And for a brief moment, nothing happened, as if the courtroom itself hesitated, unsure whether to acknowledge what had just been called. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, heads began to turn, one by one, until every eye in the room found her, the woman they had not noticed before, now rising from the back row with a quiet steadiness that felt out of place against the polished tension surrounding her. The sound of her shoes against the wooden floor was soft, measured, each step deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, but controlled, as if she had already walked this path in her mind long before this moment arrived. And still, the expressions around her did not change. Curiosity at best, dismissal at worst, the kind of looks reserved for someone who was expected to say very little and matter even less. At the prosecution table, a faint smile flickered across the attorney's face, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of expression that comes from confidence, from believing the outcome is already secured, and that whatever comes next is merely a formality to be endured before closing statements begin. Even the judge glanced briefly at the file in front of him, scanning quickly, as if searching for something that might justify why this witness had been called at all, but finding nothing that suggested importance. Naomi reached the stand and placed her hand where instructed, her voice calm as she affirmed the oath, not loud, not dramatic, but clear enough that it carried. And in that clarity, there was something that did not match the expectations already built around her. The prosecutor approached, his tone polite but edged with impatience, the kind of politeness that masks dismissal rather than respect. "Miss Carter, you are employed as a domestic worker at the Castellano residence, correct?" And she nodded once, her eyes steady. "Yes, sir." Simple, direct, offering no more than what was asked. No attempt to expand, no effort to defend, just the truth in its smallest form. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the gallery, quickly fading, as if even the audience had already decided there was nothing here worth holding on to. The prosecutor continued, pacing slightly now, building his rhythm again. "And you have no formal legal training, no background in law enforcement, no specialized expertise that would qualify you to interpret the events under question," his voice tightening just enough to guide the answer he expected. And again Naomi responded without hesitation. "No, sir," her tone unchanged, unaffected by the narrowing of his eyes or the subtle shift in posture from the jury box. There it was, the confirmation he needed, the narrowing of her role into something small, something contained, something easily dismissed. He turned slightly toward the jury, allowing the implication to settle without needing to state it directly, and for a moment, it seemed as though the room exhaled, reassured that everything was once again aligned with expectation. But Naomi did not look down, did not shrink into the role that had just been outlined for her. Instead, she remained exactly as she was, composed, present, her gaze lifting just enough to meet the space ahead of her rather than the man attempting to reduce her. And in that stillness, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a current beneath calm water. Richard Castellano watched her now, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but with a focus that had not been there before, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if recalculating something he had not anticipated, something that did not fit within the clean lines of the case being presented. The prosecutor stepped closer, his voice lowering, preparing to conclude what he believed was a straightforward exchange. "So, Miss Carter, would it be fair to say that anything you observed would be based solely on your limited perspective as a housemaid, without the context necessary to fully understand its significance?" The question hanging in the air, shaped to confine, to finalize, to close the door before it had even been opened. Naomi paused, not long, just enough for the silence to stretch, just enough for the room to lean in without realizing it. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity as before, but now there was something else beneath it, something steady, something grounded. "No, sir." And for the first time, the room did not immediately move on. The word lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, a simple refusal that carried more weight than the prosecutor had anticipated, and for a moment, he did not respond, as if recalibrating how to proceed with a witness who had not followed the script already written for her, his expression tightening just slightly before he forced a thin smile, the kind meant to recover control without revealing the shift beneath it. "No," he repeated, his tone lighter now, but edged with something sharper. "Then perhaps you would like to explain to the court what qualifies your perspective as anything more than observation from a distance." And a few quiet chuckles slipped from the back rows, subtle but present, reinforcing the assumption that whatever she said next would be easily dismissed. Naomi did not react to the laughter, did not glance toward it, her focus steady ahead, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the stand, fingers still, composed, as if the noise around her existed on a different level entirely. And when she spoke again, her voice remained even, not raised, not defensive, but clear in a way that cut through the low hum of the room. "Because I was not observing from a distance," she said, and the sentence landed differently, not loud, but precise, the kind that forces attention whether invited or not. The prosecutor's smile faltered, just enough to register, and he stepped closer, his posture shifting from casual confidence to something more direct, more probing. "Then from where exactly were you observing, Miss Carter?" The question sharpened now, no longer rhetorical, no longer dismissive, and Naomi met it without hesitation from inside the room. She replied, her tone unchanged, and this time, the silence that followed was not casual, not dismissible. It was immediate, heavy, the kind that settles when something unexpected has entered the space and no one is quite sure how to respond. The judge leaned forward slightly, his attention no longer divided between documents and routine, his gaze now fixed on the woman in front of him, and even the jurors shifted, their earlier detachment replaced by something more focused, more cautious, as if they were beginning to realize that what had been presented as a minor detail might not be so minor after all. The prosecutor cleared his throat, attempting to regain momentum. Inside the room, he repeated, slower this time. You are stating under oath that you were present during the meeting in question, and Naomi nodded once. Yes, sir. Simple again, direct, but now each word carried a different weight, no longer filling space, but reshaping it. A murmur spread through the gallery, not loud, but unmistakable, and quickly silenced by the bailiff, though the tension it carried remained, threading through the room like a current that could no longer be ignored. At the defense table, Richard Castellano's eyes did not leave her, his expression unreadable to anyone else. But beneath that stillness, something had shifted, something that looked less like control and more like recognition, as if he were seeing not the role she had been assigned, but the person who had existed beyond it all along. The prosecutor's notes remained untouched in his hand, his prepared sequence disrupted, and for the first time since the trial began, there was a pause not dictated by procedure, but by uncertainty, a gap in the structure he had built so carefully, and Naomi stood within it, not filling it with noise or explanation, but simply holding her place, her presence steady, her silence now carrying as much meaning as her words. And what exactly did you witness from inside that room? He asked finally, his voice lower, more controlled, as if careful now not to invite another answer he could not easily contain, and Naomi drew a slow breath, not out of fear, but preparation, the kind that comes before a truth that cannot be taken back once spoken, her eyes lifting just slightly, not toward him, but toward the space where every assumption in the room had begun to unravel, and when she spoke, the room did not move, did not whisper, did not breathe, because something in the way she held that moment made it clear that whatever came next would not be ignored. Naomi did not rush her answer, and that in itself began to shift the balance of the room, because silence, when held with intention, can carry more authority than a dozen hurried words, and she let that silence settle just long enough for every eye to remain fixed on her before she spoke, her voice steady and unembellished. I witnessed the conversation that took place before the documents were signed, and the phrasing was deliberate, careful, not dramatic, but precise in a way that immediately narrowed the space for interpretation. The prosecutor straightened slightly, his attention sharpening. What conversation are you referring to? He asked, and this time, there was no trace of dismissal in his tone, only control, carefully measured, as if he understood now that each word mattered more than he had first assumed. Naomi's gaze did not waver. The one regarding the terms that were not included in the written agreement, she said, and a ripple of movement passed through the jury, subtle but unmistakable, as pens paused, as eyes lifted, as the neat structure of the case began to show its first visible fracture. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, his hand tightening around the file he held. Miss Carter, are you suggesting that there were verbal conditions outside of the signed contract? And Naomi nodded once. Yes, sir. Her tone unchanged, grounded in the same quiet certainty that had carried her this far, and something about that consistency made it harder to challenge, harder to dismiss. And how? He continued, taking a step closer. Would you have understood the nature of such a conversation? The question sharpened now, probing for weakness, for inconsistency, for anything that could reduce her credibility back to its original assumption. Naomi paused again, but this time it was not hesitation, it was alignment, as if she were placing each word exactly where it needed to go before allowing it to be heard. Because I recognized the language, she said, and the sentence seemed simple at first, almost understated, until its implication began to unfold in the minds of those listening. The judge leaned forward further, his fingers resting against the bench, his attention fully engaged now. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice no longer routine, but intent, and Naomi turned her gaze slightly, acknowledging him without breaking her composure. "The phrasing used to describe liability and dispute resolution," she replied. "It was not consistent with the terms presented in the contract that was later submitted as evidence." The courtroom stilled completely, the kind of stillness that does not come from instruction, but from realization, and even the faint sounds that had existed before seemed to disappear, as if the room itself understood that something significant had just been introduced. The prosecutor did not interrupt immediately, and that delay spoke louder than any objection could have. His earlier confidence now tempered by the awareness that this line of questioning was no longer entirely within his control. At the defense table, Richard Castellano remained motionless, but his eyes had changed, no longer distant, no longer calculating in the same detached way, but focused, present, as if each word she spoke was confirming something he had already begun to suspect but could not prove on his own. Naomi continued, not because she was prompted, but because the truth, once started, does not easily stop. The clause that was discussed would have allowed for external arbitration under conditions that were never disclosed in the final document, she said, and the clarity of her explanation carried through the room with an authority that did not come from title or position, but from understanding, from having seen and recognized something others had overlooked. A faint shift moved through the jury again, this time more pronounced, as if the foundation beneath the case they had been presented was no longer as solid as it had seemed just minutes before. The prosecutor finally spoke, his voice lower now, more controlled. "Miss Carter, are you claiming that the contract submitted to this court does not reflect the full agreement between the parties?" And Naomi met the question without hesitation, her answer immediate, unshaken. "Yes, sir." And in that moment, the room did not react with noise or movement, but with something far more powerful, a collective pause, a recognition that the narrative they had been following was no longer complete, and that the person they had underestimated had just become the most important voice in the room. The silence did not break immediately, and that delay spoke louder than any objection ever could, because in that suspended moment, every person in the courtroom understood that something fundamental had shifted, not through volume or force, but through clarity, and the prosecutor, who had once moved with effortless confidence, now stood still, his next words measured carefully. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone controlled but no longer dismissive, "you are making a serious claim about the integrity of the evidence presented to this court." And Naomi did not flinch, did not look away, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that made the weight of his statement feel less like pressure and more like confirmation. "Yes, sir," she answered, and the simplicity of it carried more authority than any elaborate defense could have. The judge leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on her with a new level of scrutiny, not skepticism, but consideration, the kind reserved for testimony that cannot be ignored. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you are stating under oath that you recognize discrepancies between the spoken terms and the written contract." And Naomi inclined her head once. "Yes, Your Honor." And there was something in the way she said it, something grounded, something precise, that made it clear she was not guessing, not speculating, but recalling. A faint shift moved through the jury, subtle but undeniable, as several members leaned forward, their earlier detachment replaced by focused attention, and the courtroom, which had once treated her as background, now held its breath around her words. The prosecutor stepped forward again, though his pace had slowed, his movements more deliberate now, as if he were navigating unfamiliar ground. "Then I will ask you directly," he said, "what exactly led you to recognize this so-called discrepancy?" And Naomi allowed a brief pause, not for effect, but for accuracy, as if ensuring that what she was about to say would leave no room for misinterpretation. "The wording," she replied, "specifically the phrasing used to describe arbitration authority and liability limitations," and a faint crease appeared between the prosecutor's brows, not confusion, but concern, because the answer was not what he had expected. "Those are legal distinctions," he pressed, attempting to regain control, "terms that typically require formal training to fully understand." And Naomi met his gaze without resistance. without challenge, simply stating what was true. "I studied contract law for 2 years," she said, and the room reacted before it could stop itself, a ripple of surprise that moved through the gallery, through the jury, even through the attorneys seated at their respective tables, because the narrative they had accepted without question was no longer intact. The prosecutor blinked once, his composure tightening. "You studied law," he repeated, as if the words needed confirmation to be believed, and Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir," her voice steady. "Before I had to leave school," and she did not elaborate, did not offer explanation or justification, because none was needed. The fact itself carried enough weight. The judge's posture shifted again, his attention now fully engaged. "And during your time of employment," he asked, "you were present for a discussion in which these terms were outlined differently than what appears in the submitted document?" And Naomi answered without hesitation, "Yes, Your Honor," and the certainty in her tone left little room for doubt. At the defense table, Richard Castellano exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if a piece of something long unresolved had just fallen into place, his eyes still fixed on Naomi, no longer assessing her as an unknown variable, but recognizing her as something far more significant, a witness not of circumstance, but of truth. The prosecutor's notes remained untouched, his prepared argument unraveling quietly in his hands, and for the first time since the trial began, he did not immediately know how to proceed, because the person he had dismissed as irrelevant had just introduced a perspective he could not easily dismantle. Naomi stood exactly where she had been, unchanged by the shift around her, her presence neither larger nor smaller than before, but now impossible to ignore, and in that stillness, in that unwavering clarity, the room began to understand that the case they thought they knew was no longer the same case at all. The shift in the courtroom was no longer subtle. It had settled into something heavier, something that could not be ignored or redirected, and the prosecutor, who had built his case on certainty, now stood facing a version of events that refused to fit neatly into his narrative, his voice measured as he spoke again. "Miss Carter, you are asking this court to believe that a legally binding document was altered in a way that changes its entire meaning," and Naomi did not move, did not react to the weight of the implication, her answer steady. "I am stating that the document does not reflect what was agreed upon in that room," and the distinction, though slight in wording, carried a precision that tightened the atmosphere even further. The judge leaned forward once more, his attention fully anchored now. "Miss Carter," he said, "can you describe exactly what you heard during that conversation?" And the room seemed to narrow around her, every sound fading into the background as Naomi drew a quiet breath, not out of hesitation, but alignment, as if organizing memory into something that could be understood by those who had not been there. "The discussion focused on limiting exposure," she began, her voice even, "specifically through third-party arbitration that would be selected externally, not mutually agreed upon," and several members of the jury exchanged glances, the legal implications of such phrasing settling in with growing clarity. The prosecutor stepped in quickly, attempting to contain the direction. "Miss Carter, you are interpreting a conversation that you overheard while performing your duties, are you not?" And Naomi turned her gaze slightly toward him, not defensive, but grounded. "I was present in the room, not outside of it," she said. And again, the correction was quiet but firm, removing the distance he was trying to impose. "And where exactly were you positioned?" he pressed, his tone tightening, searching for inconsistency. "Near the west side table, organizing files that had been placed there before the meeting began," she answered, her recall precise, unshaken, and the specificity of her response left little room for doubt. The judge's pen moved slowly across the page in front of him, not hurried, but deliberate, as if each word now carried significance that required careful documentation. "Continue," he instructed, and Naomi did, her voice maintaining the same calm rhythm that had begun to reshape the room itself. "One of the parties asked for clarification regarding liability if the agreement was challenged, and the response given stated that the arbitration process would prevent public litigation under most circumstances," she said, and the phrasing hung in the air, its implications unfolding in silence rather than reaction. The prosecutor's posture stiffened, his earlier ease replaced by focus. That statement does not appear in the contract submitted to this court, he said, and Naomi met the observation without hesitation. No, sir, it does not. And the acknowledgement landed with finality, not as accusation, but as fact. A quiet tension moved through the jury again, more pronounced now, as if the pieces they had been given were no longer forming a complete picture, and the gap between what was presented and what was described continued to widen. At the defense table, Richard Castellano's gaze remained fixed, his expression controlled, but no longer detached, as if each word Naomi spoke was not only altering the case, but revealing something he had not been able to articulate himself. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, his grip on the file loosening just slightly. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice lower now, more cautious, "why did you not come forward with this information sooner?" And for the first time, there was a shift in the air that felt different, not confrontational, but human, a question that extended beyond legal strategy into something more personal. Naomi paused, not because she lacked an answer, but because she understood the weight of it, her hands still resting lightly against the stand, her voice when it came just as steady as before. "Because I was not asked," she said, and the simplicity of the response cut deeper than any elaborate explanation, leaving the room in a silence that no one moved to break. The answer did not echo. It settled, quiet and absolute, and the effect it had on the room was immediate, not through sound but through absence of it, because no one expected something so simple to carry that much weight, and the prosecutor, who had been prepared for resistance or justification, found himself with neither, only a statement that left no room for argument, his lips parting slightly before he closed them again, as if reconsidering his next move in real time. The judge's gaze remained fixed on Naomi, studying not just her words but the consistency behind them, the absence of hesitation, the absence of performance, and after a brief pause, he leaned forward, his voice measured. "Miss Carter, are you stating that your testimony today is the first time you have been formally asked to recount what you witnessed?" And Naomi nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor," and again. The clarity in her tone left nothing uncertain. A subtle shift moved through the jury, more pronounced now, as if each member was recalibrating their understanding of not just the case, but the process that had brought them here, and for the first time, doubt did not sit with the witness, it settled elsewhere. The prosecutor adjusted his stance, the confidence he had entered with now replaced by careful calculation. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice lower, more controlled, "you understand that the court relies on complete and accurate information from all parties involved." And Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without challenge. "Yes, sir." And he continued, "Then help us understand why this information, which you claim is significant, was not presented during earlier proceedings." And there it was again, the attempt to redirect, to place the burden back on her. But Naomi did not resist, did not deflect, she simply answered, "Because no one asked me what I heard, they asked me what I saw." And the distinction, though subtle, landed with precision, drawing a line between observation and understanding that had not been considered before. The courtroom remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer passive. It was attentive, almost expectant, as if every person present now recognized that something essential had been overlooked, not by accident, but by assumption. The judge's pen paused above the paper in front of him, his attention sharpening further. "Clarify that for the court," he said, and Naomi did, her voice unwavering. "I was asked to confirm who was present, where they were seated, and when the meeting began and ended," she explained, "but I was never asked to describe the conversation itself." And the explanation unfolded without accusation, without emotion, just fact, and in that neutrality, it became harder to challenge. The prosecutor's jaw tightened slightly, his prepared structure continuing to unravel. "And you chose not to volunteer that information," he said, and Naomi met the question calmly. "I was instructed to answer only what was asked," and there was no defiance in her tone, only adherence, a quiet reflection of the rules that had governed her position long before she entered this courtroom. At the defense table, Richard Castellano lowered his gaze briefly, not in avoidance, but in recognition, as if understanding now the boundaries she had operated within. boundaries that had kept the truth contained until this exact moment. The jury exchanged another series of glances, more deliberate this time, the kind that signaled a shared realization, and the courtroom, which had once been guided by a clear narrative, now found itself navigating something far less certain. The prosecutor took a step back, his movement slower than before, his voice when it returned quieter. "Miss Carter," he said, "are you aware of the implications your testimony carries?" And Naomi's answer came without pause, without embellishment. "Yes, sir." And in that moment, it was no longer a question of whether she understood, but whether anyone else in the room had fully understood her until now. The question lingered in the air, but it no longer carried the same authority it once had, because something had shifted beyond control, beyond strategy, and the courtroom, once guided by a clear direction, now felt suspended in a space where truth was unfolding in real time, not shaped, not filtered, but revealed, and Naomi stood at the center of it without raising her voice, without demanding attention, simply existing in a way that made it impossible to look away. The judge adjusted his posture slowly, his gaze steady, his voice when it came quieter but far more deliberate. "Miss Carter, based on your testimony, the court must consider whether the agreement presented reflects the full scope of what was discussed," and the weight of that statement settled over the room like a final piece falling into place, not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable. The prosecutor did not interrupt this time, did not object, because there was nothing immediate to challenge, only a reality that required reconsideration, and his silence spoke louder than any argument he could have made. Naomi did not react outwardly, did not allow the shift around her to change her composure, her hands still resting lightly against the stand, her posture unchanged, as if she understood that her role was not to influence, but to reveal, and that once revealed, the outcome no longer belonged to her. A faint movement came from the jury, several members exchanging glances not of confusion, but of recognition, as if the structure they had been given had quietly collapsed beneath the weight of a single overlooked detail, and now they were left to rebuild their understanding from something far more grounded. The judge turned slightly, his attention moving between both legal teams. "The court will require a review of the submitted documentation in light of this testimony," he said, his tone firm, controlled, leaving no room for dismissal, and the words carried a finality that did not need emphasis. At the defense table, Richard Castellano remained still, but his presence had changed, no longer defined by tension or calculation, but by something quieter, something closer to acknowledgement, his eyes resting on Naomi with a steadiness that had not been there before, not as a superior observing someone beneath him, but as a man recognizing the source of a truth he could not have brought forward himself. Naomi did not return the gaze immediately, her focus remaining forward, grounded, but after a moment, she allowed her eyes to shift slightly, meeting his just once, and in that brief exchange, there was no need for words, only understanding, the kind that does not announce itself, but remains. The prosecutor finally stepped back, his earlier confidence replaced by restraint, his role now limited not by defeat, but by the recognition that the narrative he had constructed was incomplete, and that completeness could no longer be controlled. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the quiet of expectation, it was the quiet of realization, the kind that settles when every person present understands that something irreversible has occurred, not through force, but through clarity. Naomi exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in triumph, but in completion, as if she had fulfilled something that had been waiting long before this moment, and without drawing attention, without seeking acknowledgement, she stepped down from the stand when instructed, her movements as calm as when she had approached it, the same measured steps, the same steady presence. But now the room did not look past her, did not dismiss her, every eye following her path as she returned to her seat. And in that silent recognition, without applause, without declaration, the balance of the room had shifted entirely, not because the most powerful man had spoken, but because the quietest voice had finally been heard. The courtroom did not return to what it had been, because once something essential is revealed, there is no quiet way to put it back. And even as proceedings continued in the formal sense, something deeper had already concluded, something that did not require a gavel to confirm it. The judge reviewed the documents again, slower this time, not scanning, but examining, each page no longer accepted at face value, and the subtle tightening around his eyes spoke of a realization that could not be undone. The prosecutor remained still, his earlier momentum gone, replaced by a careful restraint, as if every word from this point forward had to be chosen with precision, not confidence. And at the defense table, Richard Castellano sat without movement. But the tension that once defined him had eased into something quieter, something closer to acceptance than resistance. Naomi remained in her seat at the back, exactly where she had been before she was called, her hands once again folded in her lap, her posture unchanged, and yet nothing about her presence was the same, because now the room understood what it had overlooked, not through apology, not through acknowledgement spoken aloud, but through the way every glance that passed her carried a different weight than before. The jury no longer avoided looking in her direction, no longer dismissed her as part of the background, but instead held a quiet awareness, as if each of them recognized that the clarity they now carried had come from a place they had not thought to value. The judge's voice finally broke through the stillness, steady but marked by the gravity of reconsideration. The court will recess pending further review of the evidence in light of the testimony presented. And the words, though procedural, carried a finality that extended beyond the moment, signaling not just a pause, but a shift in the foundation of the case itself. Papers moved, chairs adjusted, the soft sounds of transition returning to the room, but they felt different now, less certain, less controlled, as if the structure that once held everything in place had quietly loosened. Richard rose slowly, not hurried, not dramatic, and for a brief moment, his gaze moved across the room until it found Naomi again, and this time, he did not look away, not immediately, because there was something in that moment that required acknowledgement, not of power, not of status, but of truth, and though no words were exchanged, the silence between them carried more meaning than anything spoken throughout the entire proceeding. Naomi did not stand, did not seek recognition. She simply remained where she was, grounded, steady, as if the role she had fulfilled did not belong to the spotlight, but to something quieter, something more enduring. One by one, people began to leave, conversations hushed, movements restrained, the usual noise of departure softened by the weight of what had occurred. And still, Naomi did not move until the room had nearly emptied, until the space returned to something closer to stillness. When she finally stood, there was no urgency in her steps, no need to look back, because whatever needed to be said had already been spoken, and whatever needed to be understood had already begun to take root. She walked toward the exit the same way she had entered, unnoticed at first, but not anymore, and as she reached the door, the light from the hallway spilled softly across the polished floor, catching just enough to mark her passage without announcing it. And in that quiet, without applause, without recognition written into any record, the truth remained, steady and undeniable, not because it had been declared by power, but because it had been spoken with dignity, and that day, in a room built on authority, it was dignity that endured. In a tense courtroom where power and perception collide, a quiet Black Maid steps forward to deliver testimony that no one expected, facing a powerful mafia boss whose fate hangs on every word spoken. And as assumptions begin to unravel, the truth emerges not through force but through clarity, creating a gripping narrative that blends dignity, intelligence, and emotional depth within a compelling dark romance atmosphere that challenges everything the room believed, as the Black Maid reveals. Hidden knowledge shaped by her past and the limitations placed upon her role, the mafia boss becomes a silent witness to a transformation that redefines authority, respect, and human worth, turning the courtroom into a stage where dark romance tension builds not through love alone, but through recognition, restraint, and moral awakening. This story captures the essence of dark romance by intertwining power imbalance with emotional revelation, where the Black Maid is no longer invisible and the mafia boss is no longer untouchable. As silence becomes more powerful than accusation and truth reshapes the narrative in ways no one can control. Through layered storytelling and cinematic pacing, the audience experiences a unique dark romance journey rooted in justice and quiet strength, where every glance and every pause carries meaning, and where the presence of the Black Maid shifts the balance of the room, without ever raising her voice, leaving the Mafia Boss to confront a reality he did not expect. In the end, this dark romance narrative stands as a powerful exploration of dignity, intelligence, and the unseen forces that define human connection, proving that even in the most controlled environments, truth delivered with calm precision can change everything, and that sometimes the most unforgettable dark romance moments are not spoken loudly, but remembered in silence.